Hello and welcome to Timeline Astrology. My name is Gary O'Toole. This video is all about Pluto Saturn conjunctions throughout history and even looking into the future and far off into the future. And why do this? Well, I think it's appropriate in terms of placing the current Pluto Saturn conjunction in context and seeing how this has always played out. And of course, astrology looks at cycles always. And as we look at cycles, we're projecting that forward and realizing that it's not a linear journey where we're constantly experiencing the return of these big themes. And they are certainly big themes in relation to Pluto and Saturn. Pluto, the slowest moving planet, if you categorize it as a planet, Saturn, the slowest moving visible planet. And when these two slow planets come together, of course, it feels slow. It's the issues that they bring up feel like they're insurmountable at times, and that the Lord of Time, Saturn, conjunct the Lord of the Underworld, Pluto, creating this end times feel where it feels like, this is like almost like the extinction of humanity. We are at the precipice here. And so that's how it feels. It doesn't necessarily mean that's what's going to happen. And I certainly don't think that's what's going to happen, because if I point out historical conjunctions, you'll see how they would have had just as much of a feel of end times as perhaps our current era. Now, I do think, having said that, that the current conjunction and its ongoing conjunction in the same sign, which I am referring to sidereal signs here, by the way, which are more in line with the actual constellations. I study in Indian astrology. So the current conjunction and the ongoing conjunction in the sign Capricorn, sidereal Capricorn, and right back to their initial conjunction in the same sign, sidereal Sagittarius from 2017, has been really dragged out because they've met in two signs. So initially Sagittarius, and their exact conjunction was at 28 degrees of sidereal Sagittarius. And then they moved into Capricorn in 2020, and that continues until January 2023. So it's really spread out over 6 years. Actually, you can count 7 years from 2017 to 2023. So usually, though, they come together in one sign over up to maybe 3 years at most. Saturn usually transit the sign for 2.5 years, but it might dip in and out of the sign. So it could be 3 years. And usually it's just one conjunction, one exact conjunction. So these charts that I'm going to show you now are the exact conjunction, but although exact, there obviously was a period of many years leading up to that exact conjunction, and then away from that conjunction, the aftermath that was felt, like almost like an earthquake and the tremors that were felt after. And by the way, I will be showing you events like volcanoes like we're seeing right now in La Palma, and why that would be the case with a Saturn Pluto conjunction also. And so maybe let's get to that first, because this is obviously imminent, this sense of threat of, let's face it, there are like queues here in the UK, there are queues, people lining up, trying to get their fuel, this sense of lack and scarcity and all of that. It's like literally this kind of end times kind of hoarding kind of sense. The volcano in La Palma again, all of these things represent this conjunction, which is basically a conjunction between Pluto, the Lord of the Underworld, which is literally like a volcano pulling things up from the earth and spewing it out all over the place and redrawing literally the landscape, and Saturn, the planet of form and structure, being reformed and restructured and changed. And I'll show you how every time they come together, they change, like volcanoes change things, change the land, but also in countries and borders and boundaries in countries, how that's changed throughout history when they've come together, and even personally in terms of our own sense of autonomy and a sense of being restrained in some way also. So it's a very personal thing as well as a global thing, is what I'm saying. So if we jump all the way back to 1883, I'll just go back to 1883. At the time they conjoined in sidereal Taurus at 7 degrees of sidereal Taurus. And this was a highly, actually, this was a period that was on the one hand very destructive, because of course later on in the year, in August especially, there was a major volcano eruption in Indonesia in the Krakatoa volcano. If you remember your history lesson, 1883, 40,000 people died. So, comparing it to, the current volcano in La Palma or the previous one in Iceland, I mean, this was massive. That was in 1883, but that was in August. I think the main, it obviously was leading up to that in August, and in May of that year. Let me bring it back to May because I was just playing around with dates here. It was the 22nd of May. So on this date here, 7 degrees of Taurus. This was the lunar mansion called Kritika, which is relevant also. If I mention the lunar mansion, Taurus, of course, represents infrastructure and things like that. And in 1883, there was a lot of changes going on. First European power station, the Orient Express took its maiden voyage from Paris to Istanbul. The first electric overhead wires were installed. I mean, this is very much about Kritika and Taurus. Kritika, for those who don't follow Indian astrology, is the lunar mansion that's ruled by the god of fire, Agni, and it represents fire and energy. And of course, you can see electricity is part of that story, and European power station and all of that, and the overhead wires. You can kind of see that then the infrastructure of the overhead wires being built. So that was kind of like a redrawing of the energy circuits on the planet, if you will, in that way. In a sense, that was actually a more helpful redrawing of things. That certainly hasn't been the case always with this conjunction. But again, of course, that massive volcano later on in the August in Indonesia, that was a massive event. So let's move it to the next one. So these occur every 33 years or so. So of course, it takes Saturn about 30 years, 29 to 30 years to move around the zodiac, and then to catch up again with Pluto, which moves very slowly. It's about 33 years. So the next one would have been in 1914. And there's a couple of really interesting things about this conjunction. One is that they conjoined in Gemini and in the lunar mansion called Ardra, which is probably one of the most disruptive lunar mansions, along with its opposite, Mula. The goddess of death resides in Mula, in Sagittarius, and this god Rudra, the fierce and angry red form of Shiva, the god of destruction, rules Ardra. And so Rudra is called the howler, the wailer, and it creates a lot of chaos and destruction and tears. That's literally the symbol of this sign, a teardrop. So, of course, 1914 was the beginning of World War I. And the other interesting thing about this is that this is, and it hasn't happened since then, and it won't for some time. They came together by exact conjunction on 2 occasions, in 1914, October, and in 1912, or 1915, the following year, sorry, in May. And that was at 8 degrees because, of course, Saturn and Pluto retrograde every year. And so they went back and then they started moving forward and then came into alignment again at the 8-degree mark. So they stayed within this really volatile lunar mansion here, Ardra. So anyway, so that was World War I. I mean, I don't think there's any more to be said about that. Let me bring up the next one. So again, around 33 years later. So we're going to be looking at 1947. So 1947, this is the North Indian style chart, by the way, if you're not familiar with it. And this is the one I prefer, the South Indian. So here you can see they conjoined at 20 degrees of sidereal Cancer. It was the lunar mansion called Ashlesha, which is ruled by the Sarpas or serpent deities. And there's something very slippery, shall we say, about this particular lunar mansion that creates a lot of uncertainty and, chaos, basically. There's a lot of manipulations that can occur with this on a personal level, but on a global level, sure, that's blown out into extremes. And of course, what happened in 1947? Well, you had the partition between India and Pakistan. Millions of people had died then. You had Israel the following year. And this is, of course, ongoing. And what's always interesting to see is that when you pull it forward to the next conjunction, and if it's in a square, as it many times is, the next conjunction in Libra, you'll see, is in a square to this. It points back to the themes of that. So Israel, of course, and what's happening in Israel currently in Palestine, or India, and the tensions again. Because again, remember, Saturn is the border, is the boundary, and Pluto changes boundaries or threatens borders and boundaries. And then what we tend to see is countries and people trying to shore up their borders, and boundaries, like personal boundaries, as well as countries' borders. We see a lot of tension then at borders. Of course, so 1947, there was massive, in terms of redrawing of these borders and boundaries throughout Europe and in the world. So the next time was in 1982. And actually, before I go to 1982, I just want to say one more thing about 1947, which is fascinating. And that is, in 1947, 1948, when Saturn and Pluto were conjunct here in Cancer, George Orwell wrote his novel 1984. So of course 1984 is all about this dystopian future, and what we're seeing, many of which we're seeing the themes play out in very real ways. It was a book of fiction, but it's like, this kind of Big Brother sort of scenario. And he wrote it while Saturn and Pluto were conjoined in Cancer in 1947 and 1948. So his mindset was basically in this kind of dystopian world because of the conjunction at the time of him writing it. And then what's really interesting is that, he said it in 1984, but if you fast forward to 1984, it was actually 1982 by exact conjunction, and then 83, 84, they were together in Libra in a square to that. So here they are again. Now, what's interesting in 1982 is that they actually started conjoining, in a sense, in the same sign from 1979. Saturn moved into Virgo, Pluto was finishing up with Virgo. Then they conjoined in the next sign, Libra, and exactly at 3 degrees of Libra, this lunar mansion Chitra, which is all about architecture and design. And of course, the Libra section of this lunar mansion is all about diplomacy. And in terms of countries, of course, it's diplomacy especially, but it's Saturn Pluto. And what did we see in the 80s was, of course, the Cold War. And if you were around in the 80s and you were very aware of what was going on around the world, you would have been aware, just as we are now, of this kind of dynamic, this Cold War dynamic, and these kind of end times feel that we're all feeling, this sense of, it could just take anything to set something off, and living in this kind of fear of, a nuclear disaster or something or other, right? And so this is Saturn Pluto. It feels like an end times. It isn't the end times, of course. It is an end of something, the way things have been, but it isn't the end. Now, the other thing that happened in the early 80s, of course, was the AIDS crisis. And of course, this is the sign Libra. So it was a sexually transmitted disease. They didn't know that from the beginning, but this is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction here in the lunar mansion Chitra in Libra. So that's 1982. What happened in 1982 also was the a massive volcano that erupted in Mexico. And that had such a huge impact for months. So obviously there's this repeating theme about volcanoes. When you think about Saturn as the structure, the form, the Earth's crust, and Pluto, the lord of the underworld, and just bubbling to the surface and literally transforming the crust. You can think about it that way. So that was 1982. The next time then, of course, was the last time, and that was last year in 2020. So we had let me show you this now, because if you're used to following the tropical, this will be a bit different, so just bear with me. So it was in sidereal Sagittarius at 28 degrees. And then they moved into Capricorn together. So they, are currently in Capricorn. Saturn is still in Capricorn. So therefore, Saturn and Pluto are still conjunct in a sense in the same sign, although quite a wide orb now. But they're still in the same sign. And they actually moved into the same sign from 2017. And they won't move out of the same sign until 2023. So that's actually 7 years. And really, just like the 80s, it's feeling really dragged out. And so you have this kind of Cold War mentality again. You have all of these very destructive acts, uprisings. And what is Sagittarius and Capricorn? Well, first of all, Sagittarius, where they conjoined exactly, is about religion, it's about belief, it's about laws. And you could say, and as many are saying, that we are living in this post-truth era, because Saturn and Pluto's conjunction here has really destroyed so many of our belief systems about the institutions, like religious institutions that we once looked to, or people for advice. And you can't even look for advice to anyone now, because you just don't know who to believe anymore, because of this dissolving of the truth in many ways. But it's a changing of where we look to for truth as well, which is still in a lot of flux, of course, at the moment. What's interesting to know is that the platform I'm releasing this on, of course, is called YouTube. And YouTube was formed as soon as Pluto moved into sidereal Sagittarius in 2005. So in a way that started eroding. And I know I realize the irony of this as I'm speaking on this platform. That really, though, started the eroding of truth. Because, you know, when everybody has an opinion and everybody can broadcast themselves, everybody has their own truth. It's a very subjective thing. And that's what the sign Sagittarius is all about. We all have our sense of truth. But when everyone has their sense of truth, then we then have to question, what is truth, capital T truth. So then, of course, Saturn, Pluto moved into Capricorn, where they are now. If I show you where they are now, they're now still within Capricorn. Pluto is still at the very first degree of Capricorn. They're both retrograde, and they're both stationing now in October 2021, and will move direct. But stationing means that they're not appearing to move, and that really intensifies. Just as if we look all the way back into 1883, they were stationing, and we saw that, you know, eruption in Krakatoa. What we're seeing now is La Palma, and so it's like the planets really start to tighten their grip and force these kinds of eruptions. And again, that's in the Earth itself, but in terms of our personal lives, that is also the case. What I found really interesting as well recently is that even down to fashion choices having an impact, how we can see the Saturn-Pluto conjunction play out in terms of what we saw in the Met Gala recently, and how there's a general return to this fetish wear, S&M kind of thing. And of course, that was also a case in the 80s during their conjunction, and there was a big S&M scene at the time. And the reason for that, of course, is that Saturn is restriction and Pluto is the Lord of Death. So it feels, you know, very restrictive. And at the same time, we want to break out of our restrictions. So it's as much about, you know, breaking out of the bond or the ties or the harnesses as it is about putting them on and restricting ourselves, and actually, you know, wanting to take some control back, as psychologists would say about, you know, S&M and even just wearing fetish wear. So that's another theme really of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction at the moment. Like I said, this is going to continue now until Saturn leaves Capricorn in 2023. Remember, I'm talking about the sidereal zodiac here, if you're not familiar with it. So anyway, that's the current news. What about we look forward and we see, how does this play out in the future? Oh yeah, sorry, I'm just putting Pluto and it will give me the years. So next one is 2054. Let's see what's going to happen then. Obviously, this is all hypothetical, but let's see what may happen then. They're going to come together in sidereal Aquarius at 18 degrees, which is the lunar mansion called Shatabishak. And Shatabishak is often translated as 100 healers. But it's very sort of a very vague, it's part of the sky that has a lot of stars. So it's like 100 healers. It's called that for a reason, because there's so many stars. One of the symbols is a circle, an empty circle. And so there's this theme with this sign of all of these kind of apparent paradoxes being able to be contained within something. So it's like, it really highlights the theme of Aquarius and the sort of eccentricity of the sign, basically, the seeming paradoxes of the sign. And so technologies are a big thing, of course. Healing is a big thing. The fact that these are coming together now in 2054, you could imagine that by that stage, technology will have taken off so much, and you know that we'll be interacting with it and wearing tech so much more, that this kind of changing of the boundaries could be massive in terms of technological boundaries, and who knows where that could take us after this. I have no idea. I couldn't even imagine. But anyway, if we go even further into the future, let's see where we could end up. And the next one is 2086. And interestingly enough, this one is at the end of the zodiac, 24 degrees of sidereal Pisces. This is the lunar mansion Revati, and it's very much about coming to a conclusion and ending something in a major way, of course, during this conjunction. But it's in a square to where they came together last year, 2020, in Sagittarius, Jupiter's other sign. And so themes of Jupiter and truth seeking will take an even bigger step forward in 2086, in many years' time, for our children and grandchildren, where, you know, who knows what that's going to look like. But what I want to point out is actually the next one, which is going to be fascinating, I imagine, if, you know, whoever is on the planet. And that is in 2117, because at the time, Saturn will conjunct Pluto at 25 degrees of sidereal Aries, where Saturn is seen as debilitated at its weakest. And this can create real sort of complete breakdown of structures at the time, whatever structures they are. And actually, this could even be a war-like scenario in the sign Aries. And the question to ask would be, well, who's warring? I mean, maybe it's even like warring with other entities, maybe extraterrestrial, who knows? I don't know. I'm being facetious, but anyway, basically, this is a massive breakdown of whatever system is in place at that time. But I want to actually end with that note, because Saturn in Aries is, like I said, debilitated. It's at its weakest, where structures are really faltering. So it's like a really unstable sort of environment that we experience. And if we show where everything is right now, you might think, oh yeah, Saturn's in Capricorn, fair enough, it's strong, it's stationing now in October. But actually, in Indian astrology, we divide the signs into 9 segments, or padas, and each one corresponds to a sign of the zodiac. And so this 9 division of the sign is important, because it shows the underlying strengths and weaknesses. And it just so happens that Saturn at 12 degrees, where it's stationing right now, is the Aries division of Capricorn. So even though you might look at this and think Saturn is strong, it's actually, there's an underlying weakness to it, in other words. And this is why we're seeing the scenes we're seeing now at the moment, with a lot of instability around the world, like these long queues now for people getting their fuel and getting into a panic mode again. You know, the volcano and other things that are happening around the world. It feels very unstable right now, I would say. And that's made worse by the fact that Saturn and Pluto are coming to station and putting more and more pressure on. And that kind of pressure, like you see in a volcano, also is felt individually. And we'll see this more and more in the coming weeks, September, October, into November. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that, if that's at all something you can say about Pluto Saturn, but I hope you found it interesting. If you have any comments, I'd love to hear your comments. If you have any questions, feel free to post below. Please like and subscribe for this channel, so YouTube shows this video to more people. And I hope that's been of help, and until next time.